Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the show, and we're going to be talking about something we haven't spoken about at all in over 3 years, and I'm quite excited about it because I'm going to get to ask a bunch of things that I don't know anything about. Hopefully you're on that ride as well. We're talking to Chris Rock today, and no, not that Chris Rock. He's probably still stuck out at Burning Man. Chris Rock from SIEMonster, but from a whole bunch of other things as well. So I'm not going to bastardize and misunderstand all the things that you've done and where you're coming from. So Chris, welcome to the show, and I'm going to allow you to talk a little bit about your context and background, and then we can dive straight in.
Thanks, Vincent. No, thanks for having me. Where would you like me to start?
I just think that where you've come from in terms of your experience in information security more broadly, and some of the things that you're known for maybe in more recent times in terms of some of the talks and the interesting things that you've given and put out into the universe, I'd love to start there.
Awesome. So I've been a professional hacker for my whole life. I'm 50 now. Probably started when I was 13. So essentially there was no security job when you turned 20, 21 after university. I went into the banking sector. I spent 10 years in the banking sector doing IT and security for Australia's biggest banks. And then I saw a need for penetration testing in the market, professional hacking. So I then set up my own company and started doing pen tests around the world. I did that for about 12 years. And then one of my customers wanted a SIEM solution. So I went out and priced one for them. They said, we don't have $1 million for that SIEM solution. SIEM is just a log collection device that helps people in security work out what's going on. And then I started a security company called SIEMonster. And I essentially have two jobs. I do SIEMonster, which is my day job. And then I do security research, which is my after hours pleasure job, where I do research into topics that interest me, that just come to me.
Relating to security, presumably.
Always security, always hacking.
Security. Just living and breathing
that. I live and breathe security. I do nothing else. I suck at woodwork, don't speak another language, don't do gardening. I just do security.
Don't play an instrument badly.
No, nothing, zero. Someone was telling me about Baby Shark, and I was like, what the hell are you people talking about? I never even heard of it. And this is like 4 billion views on YouTube, rubbish about kids singing about Baby Shark. I just don't know any of that stuff.
Great. Perfect. All right. We're going to be talking a lot about security today. There's some terminology in there already. So SIEM is Security Incident Event Management. I think I got that acronym right. Is that right?
Pretty close. It's Information Event Management.
Sorry. Thank you. And so that specifically is about what we're recording to understand what's actually happening. Are people coming in, trying to do things, doing things they shouldn't be doing? Like I'm obviously putting it in. So that's one of the information security is the umbrella for what we're going to talk about today. But just to put people in the zone, like we always start this show by going into kind of the problem space and trying to ladder that up to one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the one that we're going to be focusing on today is this idea of, and this is specifically their language, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And so I kind of want to understand firstly, like the role that information security and or the lack thereof plays in kind of the fair and efficient and accountable function of government and institutions. That's where I want to start. Like what works when it works and what happens when this stuff doesn't work.
Yeah. So a perfect example though, just to relate to your audience, is things like the birth and death registration system. So in Australia, for example, when you die, the doctor comes, says you're dead and fills out half a form and then hands that form to a funeral director and he fills out the other half form about where you're going to be buried and then sends that to the birth, deaths and marriages and you're officially dead. So that's the paper-based system that you and I have been brought up with. That moved electronically. So government says, you know what, we want a centralized record, no doctor's handwriting. We want everything electronically centered. Doctor fills out his part, funeral director the second part, and then you're dead. Problem is they moved it online as quickly as they could possibly to make it easier for both the doctor and the funeral director, and they screwed it up. And I essentially presented that to the world at DEFCON on deficiencies in doing that, where I could become a doctor and funeral director within a couple of minutes and actually start killing people off in Australia and also around the world as well.
Wow. Okay. So this is probably one very narrow example of where when we move something online, we're potentially creating a whole bunch of issues. I want to understand a little bit more about, and I can guess at some, so obviously I could do that, but I'm being close to the problem and thinking about if someone could take a hold of the birth and death registry what types of things might they do in the context of either government, strong governments or institutions? Like what could you do with that information or that control?
Well, you can not only kill people, but you can birth them. So you can birth fake people and kill fake people, which means you can then birth them and then buy firearms, driver's license, sell vehicles that you don't actually own. You could complete havoc. You could have life insurance policies, and then you kill them off, and then you get life insurance payouts.
Right.
Yeah, you can do whatever you like. I mean, your listeners' children might be buying a car off somebody on eBay that doesn't even exist. So even when they track that virtual person down, they don't even exist. So it's absolute havoc to go into the birth and death registration, because once you're dead, everything's shut down. I own your bank accounts. I could kill you off, do probo, and then take all your assets.
Fascinating. And obviously this then lays havoc to everything that depends on those systems, any form of thing that you're doing, e-commerce related thing or anything else that's happening. So I want to come back a step from the kind of the inference from this was that you talked about being in the industry for 50 years. 50 years ago when this was all manual, it wasn't that this wasn't possible. It's just not possible on the scale and the speed that it is now. Is that kind of what's changed?
You're spot on. This whole centralized digital government wanting to move, and it's essentially a rock and a hard place. We know why the government want to move that way. You don't want kids who are born to a home birth, like maybe Aboriginal children that are born, that don't then get registered in the system. So you want to make it easy as possible to register a birth, but you don't want to make it too easy. But then you get someone like me or other hackers around the world that can take advantage of those systems.
Yeah. And just coming to some of the data itself, and I think it's probably, every week, if you're paying attention to this stuff globally, and that it probably every quarter, even if you're not just reading the headlines in the news, that there's a large notable institution that has millions and millions of records stolen. I think the example here in Australia, there's an Optus breach, there's a Medibank private breach from memory. I think it's a big one in the US around Experian or Equifax, one of the big credit agencies there. I want to understand not just the frequency of these things, unless that's a known, but what's the nature of the data that governments and organizations are holding about people that would be this high-risk type of data? What kind of data are we talking about?
So we're essentially talking about everything. If you look at everything, if you look at an individual hack like Experian or Medibank, you're looking at health records, you're looking at finance records. But if you, as a hacker, you get to put all that together. So if you think of 100 hacks over a 2-year period, you then have every piece of information you want on your targets. So for example, someone who works in a bank, for example, I have their name, their children, their birthday, their driver's license, SSN if you're in the States, things like tax records, default passwords they've used previously. You have an array of information that you essentially can put together to then target that person specifically. And that's what a lot of scammers do. One hack may not give you all the information you want. Multiple hacks on the same person, large exposures, means that hackers have a whole realm of information they can use to get essentially funds from this person.
Yeah. And I had a question about this later, but I was kind of curious where you have this activity happening, like typically where are the threats coming from, and not necessarily just geographically, although that might be the question, just like what types of people and what are the motivations for people who are trying to get in? Is it always financially motivated, or is there other reasons that people are trying to break these systems and get into these things and cause this kind of havoc?
Yeah, so there's multiple. Most of it is financial. So you've got organised crime, you've got disorganised crime, you've got kids causing havoc.
Hold on, what's disorganised crime? I've got an idea visually, but
they essentially don't know what. They don't know what they're doing. It's not a business for them. So these people is a complete business for them. So there's no point stealing money and then withdrawing it from an ATM. There's a chain that they follow. So it's essentially steal money, steal Bitcoin, and then they need to funnel that money, clean that money, and then get access to that money. But to answer your original question, then there's corporate espionage. So then someone will, pay a hacker to get this information from this company. We're about to do a tender bid. We want to see where we stand. The current bid is 10 million 280 dinar. Are we overbidding? So they want that corporate information. And then there's government spying on other governments, government spying on corporates to get information, for example, Chinese, North Korea, and back on, not picking on one or the other. It's just that on chip designs. Everyone's hacking anyone only because they can. It's the new crime. If it's probably the worst way of saying it, but it's like anyone can do it. Doesn't take much skill to hack, and there's a lot of us out there that do it.
Yeah. And coming into this idea of skill and motivation, like obviously if there's a financial incentive for anything, people will do it. And even when a government is doing it or it's a corporate entity is doing it to another corporate entity, presumably it's ultimately with to gain some form of advantage, to have some kind of financial outcome, or maybe geopolitical, but we'll focus on the financial ones. When it comes down to the individual though, it's like this idea that the bar is super, super low to be able to be a bad actor in this, to be an actor generally, but in this case, a bad actor. Like, talk me through some of the skill sets that an individual might be trying to procure or have to get to be able to have a meaningful impact on even a mid to a large size organization.
Pretty low, to be honest. Anyone who's been doing info security for about 2 or 3 years and English is their native language, it's really easy to do. Like, it's not difficult at all. Of course, once you penetrate an organization, what you do with it then, whether you do the Medibank where you then ransomware it, anyone who is more skilled at what they would do would have a better plan of attack instead of just holding it for ransom, maybe sell that information as you already have a buyer out there for what they're selling. There's no point robbing an art gallery unless you already have a buyer for that piece. And then essentially the more skilled hackers have been who know more people, it's a better word, in the criminal world, would have a plan of attack. But of course, you're going to have kids anywhere between 13 and 25 around the world just having a shot, and you don't need much skill to do it. It's not that hard.
Interesting. And not to get down to the exact tactics, I don't know where in conversation you get to a point where you're starting to actually tell people how to do this, or if that even matters. I guess it's all out there anyway. But, and again, this is going to be one of the questions that I ask that I don't know enough about it. But in terms of where vulnerabilities are created in systems, right? Government systems or NGOs, if they're trying to do work in another country, how much of it's system-led vulnerability versus behavioral-led vulnerability, the people running the system or using the system?
And probably 99% would be behavior-based, not actual technical.
Right.
Then, of course, there is technical attacks and they're more skilled, but you're talking about financial crime. It's easy for me to send an email to somebody within Medibank and get access to their system within 10 minutes without me trying to reverse engineer a firewall, an application, a front-end web or whatever. Not getting technical, but it's so much easier just to send an email to 1,000 people on LinkedIn that work at Medibank, get someone to click on it, and I'm in. And it's just me just moving around.
Yeah. And the reason why, I set it up as a leading question because I think, and in any industry, when you watch a movie with your industry, you look at it and go, it's nothing like that. And one of the funniest things to do is to watch a film like Sneakers where there's hackers involved, or I forget the one that Hugh Jackman was in where he had to go and do some stuff and hack in for John Travolta. And anyone in IT watching that film was like, oh my God, this is so lame. But in all of that popular culture, we imagine that information security and vulnerabilities are all some lone wolf, Neo type person who has some gifted fingers who's just getting around firewalls and green screens coming down. But what you're saying is that the reality is most of what's happening is some form of social engineering that is actually working out how to actually get legitimate access from someone who shouldn't be giving you that access and then doing something once you're inside.
Correct. It's just too much work to do the other way. It's just way too much work to find a 0 day in an application or firewall. You're looking at a month, 2, 6, and if that's your job, that's great. But when you can do it socially so easily, why go through all that extra work? Again, if it's a financial crime, you don't do stuff unnecessarily.
Interesting. And just to expand on that a bit more.
Well, hackers are lazy by nature, so essentially, if you can hack in quicker, do it quickly.
Or more easily, okay. We shouldn't be laughing about hacking, but that is an interesting insight. Includes me to 2 related points then. If getting in and getting access to the stuff is not the hard bit in terms of the bar's fairly low for organizations just because you just have to find the weakest link, the one person out of 1,000 who will accidentally click on the thing and give you the thing. Where does it shift to in terms of if you have an organization, let's say you're a small government or you're a state, like a local council, and you hold a bunch of information because they probably do and a bunch of money. I think they hold a bunch of trust funds in local councils. What are they typically trying to do? Are they trying to improve the behaviors of the users? Are they trying to work out people are going to get in? We need to work out when people are in and stop there, or they need to work out how to stop the downstream thing. You got to make sure that there isn't a market for this stuff, or like where do the kind of the solutions live if not in the stopping the social engineering part, kind of the low bar?
Yeah, good question. So it's actually multi-tiered. So the first approach is training the user. For example, in your scenario, the council worker. So training the council worker on what or not to click on. If someone sends you a USB stick, a CD-ROM, or you find a USB stick in the car park, don't insert it. So it's that normal security training. And that's step 1. Step 2 is the user's going to click on things. You send an email to 1,000 workers, one person, probably in our real world, probably 50 people will click on it. So then there's the next layer of defense. And that is essentially you want to isolate that user. So if somebody clicks on something, there'll be software installed on their PC that will notice that behavior and then shut that user down so it doesn't then penetrate the rest of the network. So that's like layer 2. And third layer is then you then have restrictive information. So councils, you don't have a receptionist of the council having access to funds or trust funds and stuff like that. So that person cannot access that normally. So if I attack the receptionist, get access to the receptionist machine, and I don't get shut down by their software, I don't have quick access to trust funds. So there's that isolation. Yeah. And then the next step is the SIEM solution that we talked about before. Essentially, it's a bit like a security guard or a video camera feed. A SIEM essentially records everything that goes in an organization, both external hacks and internal. Mm-hmm. So if I hack a receptionist and then I start moving around the systems, that sort of behavior will be centralized to a SIEM. And then it's more of a defensive type technique than to what happened, how were we attacked, and that's what the SIEM does. So this is to answer your question, it's a layered approach, both on the training for the user and then technical controls all throughout.
Yeah, and then for me, the problem and kind of when the problem shows up is a little bit like insurance. You don't know. It doesn't become real until you have a car crash. It doesn't become real until someone hacks your system. So when you try to understand when an organization moves from zero level competency and moves up through all those layers and there has all those things, like how do you measure the impact to the organization? Because if it may not have ever happened in that 4-year period of moving from zero to hero anyway, but assuming it did, it would have obviously been massively expensive. I'm trying to understand how a government or an organization or an industry, if you like, a set of banks, quantify kind of the impact to either them or to their customers of avoiding the thing through moving from through those layers?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And this is the bit that I've noticed throughout my career is a government or a corporation will have a security budget, and I'll just make it easy. It's $1 million, just as a round figure.
Yep.
And it's never enough. It doesn't matter. If I'm in the security team, I want 10. I'm not going to get 10. When I get hacked, when the company gets hacked, I get whatever I want. I essentially get a budget of 10 mil. I get a budget of 20, whatever I want, I get. And then the company will spend that money as the knee-jerk reaction. You have whatever you want. We don't want this happening again. It's embarrassing for shareholders, directors, blah, blah, blah. After about 5 years' time, that 10 mil will then start being eroded. We haven't been attacked for 4 years. Do we really need this? At the time we did, and then I start eroding it. And I see that 10 mil drop to 1 mil. And then the whole process kicks off again and again. I've done pen tests, like professional hacking exercise for companies going, look, we haven't been hacked in 5 years. Well, let's not do a pen test anymore. It seems pretty silly. That's not a risk factor anymore. Then they get done over, and then it's the whole process over and over again. It's a merry-go-round.
Yeah, and it's good for business, but in some respects, but not ultimately good for business if we're going to take the macro on it. What I'm curious about, though, is kind of a related question is, it feels to me like there's two things that are happening here. One is that the threat is continuously evolving, but that also that the systems and the information you're trying to protect are in somewhat of a state of entropy. They're just always moving to greater levels of, we didn't realize that person left and therefore their user access got orphaned. And as a result, there's a backdoor there because their account's still active, even though they're not with the organization anymore. And that's what's happening over that 5-year period. And so the holes that continue to get presented. Like if you think about that organization from we just got hacked, we spent $1 million or $10 million. We did that for a few years and then 7 years later we got hacked again because we killed the budget midway through. What's happening that gets the organization back to a high level of threat that wasn't happening at T0?
So again, another question. You ask good questions, mate. Essentially, when companies get done over, then they think there's other companies out there that follow a process. What process do we follow? And the most common one is ISO 27001. If you're in finance, it's PCI DSS. If you're in government, it's something else. But with these sort of controls, I'll have someone like me go, you know what, using your example, someone's left the business. It's my job every 30 days to make sure that those users are off the system. So, I will follow a process to make sure those systems are removed. They then have an auditor come in every, say, 12 months, and they'll actually do a random selection. They'll say, this user left. Did they do a termination interview? Were everything revoked that you said was revoked? Show me the physical documentation this person was removed, and show me where the IT person actually removed that account from the system. Now, if your system is well budgeted, these things happen, but when budget is removed, these things get missed because you don't have a person to do the function and then the auditory function after that.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So there's essentially a lot of it is through entropy is what you're saying, because I guess the reason I asked this question isn't just to reaffirm that aspect of it, because I work with startups and see this happening even in small organizations where someone left, and I got an alert just 2 days ago for an employee who left 3 years ago. Someone's clearly trying to get into an account that doesn't even exist anymore, but I get an alert because of that. So obviously the entropy part's interesting. So probably two things, and they're totally separate questions. So we'll go with the first one is I'm interested if in some respects, even though it's been 30 years or 40 years that we've been moving all this information into computers and into mainframes and ultimately into clouds, we're still pretty early in the journey of knowing how to secure this stuff. Would that be fair?
No, you're more than fair. I'll give you an example just to cut you off before you ask the question. Sure. You got someone like Medibank who go, we got hacked, and then we've got users from 7 years ago or international students that got done over. And the first question you're going to ask is, why were these systems online? Do you need 7 years of health data online? And the answer is no. There's not one normal answer to say, I need someone's records from 6 years ago online. Now, I understand you need the records for these sort of HIPAA acts and stuff like that, but they don't need to be stored online. You can have systems stored for 1 year and then you can move it off completely offline into things like AWS Glacier storage. Does not need to be online. And to be honest, we suck at projecting data. You gave the startup example. Startups are the worst for data because they don't have someone who goes through, like even in my startup, I do the whole termination interview. I do the whole checklist, but I don't audit my own function. And because I'm in a startup, I should audit my own, but I also have somebody else. But there's nobody in there to audit my role because the company is too small. In the large organizations, it just gets completely forgotten about. Stuff stored for no reason. No one's ever questioned why we need 7 years of data online. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it sucks at both a low, small level and enterprise level as well. I see it all the time.
And I guess the kind of that in some respects that's still related to the entropy, but the question I was going to ask in this vein around the arc of the last 30 or 40 years is, if you take it from we had a computer in the office to we had these big mainframes in an offsite to we had these VPNs and then ultimately running into the cloud, the infrastructure is evolving, the technology is evolving, and the threats are evolving. And I guess my blunt question is there ever going to be a finish line for this stuff, or is it always a case of there is always an evolving threat and you need to work out how to meet that evolving threat?
There'll always be an evolving threat, and the business is faster than security. So the business will say, we need to move to the cloud, or we need to AI. If we're going to get on top of our competitor, we need an AI function. And they won't have gone through any of those risk scenarios. So the business is always pushing security, and that's normal. The security is slow, businesses are fast, but it's always going to be that catch-up game. We want a marketing agency to push this solution, and we haven't even vetted it securely first because we haven't gone through that whole architecture of this solution first, on what are the detriment of going forward with this solution.
Yeah. And you just made a comment there, which I'm curious about, where you said that my background, I used to sell a software solution to enterprise banks. And I would typically take a suit off and put jeans and a t-shirt on, usually as crappy as I could find my worst t-shirt, and then go into the basement and I'm not joking, it was the basement of the high-rise building where the DevOps crew and the IT crew hung out, and then sat down with them and said, how are you going to look at this thing? Because ultimately there's a decision maker who's going to ask you to look at it. And I need to understand what your view of it's going to be. Where you talked before about the tech, the IT function and the security function being slow in this context. Do you have a thought on why that is? Like, why would the tech part of it be slower? What's causing that?
Look, when you've got a new system in place, you've got to learn that system and then you've got to secure that system. And if you ask any CISO of any organization now, they're not even in control of their own data that they have now without a new system being in place.
Right.
Yeah, so you've got like a big company like Telstra, where's our data? Let's do an audit. Our data's in 60 different vendors. Right. Should it be with 60 different vendors? Let's do security controls. So they're not even on top of their normal job, and let alone having a new application that they don't understand. They haven't had time to evaluate. And then, because you've been in enterprises before, they go, let's go ahead with SAP, or let's go ahead with this. And it's just like a decision that was made without any security overlay. And all of a sudden then you're doing, it's cloud, it's already covered, it's got two-factor authentication. It's fine. Where's that data being stored? Where's those clusters? What country are those in? Now, all these questions never get answered quick enough.
Yeah. And then like the other thing that kind of I'm trying to reconcile with, I don't know, I was in the US for 5 years. And one of the worst experiences you can have in California as a public citizen, I guess, I mean, that's hyperbole to paraphrase Brian Reagan. One of the things that people whinge about a lot is going to the DMV, which is their version of Service New South Wales, which is where you get your license done, right? It's just unbelievably inefficiently run. The reason why I say that is when I got back to Australia and went to a Service New South Wales in Australia to get my license renewed. I hadn't been in the country for 6 years. It was take a ticket. Someone appeared in about 4 minutes and then suddenly it got dealt with. And it was fundamentally interesting to look at that dichotomy of the power of technology to enable things that were so manual and terribly done to be done incredibly efficiently and quickly. I'm curious in the context of a lot of the behaviors that you talked about in terms of educating people and understanding what's going on in systems and even auditing what happens once people leave. So the stuff that leads to the 99% or on the entropy side, is ultimately technology going to kind of make all of this stuff more efficient, make it more accessible? Is that kind of where this is heading?
Yes, you're spot on. And things like AI and quantum computing will then take it to the next level. So you'll be able to get like a chat bot, from a website. And instead of just asking stupid questions like what time are you open, it'll actually be able to do your request for you. Provide your ID, photo of your passport. You need a new license renewal. What's your address? Confirm this. Did this book, and it gets sent out to you. And then not one person was involved. It's just a complete AI, and you get your new license in the mail. And that's where we're eventually heading.
Yeah, but do you think if you take that kind of construct and apply it to the job of someone who needs to secure a system or work in a system and not make it vulnerable as a result of clicking on the wrong thing, is all that being moved to technology-based solutions so that it can be done efficiently at scale? So you don't need a $10 million budget. You could get the same outcome with a $1 million budget. Is that the progression of the industry? Yeah.
Yeah, you're spot on. You're actually spot on, because then you're looking at the flaws within the technology itself without the person. Look, you're always going to find flaws in the system, but you're then removing that human element out of it.
Yeah. And because it sounds reminiscent to the solution to guns is to sell more guns. But in this context, I think that's probably the right solution, right? If I think about SIEMonster as an example, you basically are saying that there's one set of activities, which is to being able to know what is going on inside of your system by any actor inside of your system as quickly as possible and be alerted to things that look wrong. And today to do that requires incredibly expensive solutions. So the vast majority of people either can't afford them, or even if they could, they can't get it through a budget committee, or maybe they get it for 1 year after the hack. And what you're trying to do is with SIEMonster and saying where the industry needs to go is we need to democratize access to this type of tooling so that all of these systems are more secure.
Yeah, you're right. So what we noticed doing professional hacking is we'd be in an organization such as a big bank or insurance company, and we'd just be like walking around, when I say walking, between computers, walking around, and they didn't even know we're in there. We'd actually finished the exercise and then produced the data, and they said, we didn't even know you'd penetrated the system. We had no idea. So they've got no visibility on who's in their network, and essentially these sort of tools, these SIEM sort of tools and other tools out there, they're essentially a detector. They're like the guard dog, the camera, the proximity card. They essentially, from a physical to a technical world, they're those sort of controls. So that if someone does access a door or a computer, it's locked and then it's centralized. So we can actually find out as a detective control or an automated response to that sort of activity.
And I'm a big subscriber to kind of the Peter Diamonte's kind of abundance principle, right? And if you don't know what that is listening, then I'd just Google it. But basically what he's saying is when you work out how to make something that's highly expensive that very few people can have access to incredibly cheap and accessible, you actually can transform the world. And probably the easiest example to think of is if you can make getting into space really inexpensive, even low Earth orbit, you can put thousands of small satellites in, which means you can have internet globally at a price that's cheaper than the internet you have. What does that do for the 4 billion people who don't have access to decent internet? That's game changing, right? So that abundance principle applies. And I think it feels to me like where's the kind of SpaceX equivalent in the security industry who's saying we need to make these tools that enable organizations to change the behavior of their internal users, change the behavior of the customers, and know what's going on in their systems so vastly accessible and affordable that organizations are all 10x better at this because they can actually utilize the technology to do it. Is that kind of where your industry's up to and where we're up to in the curve? Is that where SIEM is playing?
Yeah, you're spot on, Vincent. So for a perfect example, we only got into this space because one, people didn't even know we're in the network, and B, when we put a solution in front of the customer saying this will give you what you want, you will have that full visibility of your network. The price tag was $1 million+, and the customer just didn't have it. So that gave us the market opportunity to create something that not only banks or insurance companies, but those smaller companies, whether they be NGOs or charities or universities or hospitals, but then put these solutions in place at a cheap cost and have those visibility within the network. And we have a lot of those customers on our solution because it's an affordable solution. As you said, the abundance means that we've got a Canadian hospital, for example, in Ottawa that uses our software, detects attacks, and then it immediately shuts down anyone who's been penetrated by a social engineering exercise, shuts them down. So that's something that they would have never been able to have before to protect not only their staff members, but also their patient data as well.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating because I just think if I think about a small hospital in Ottawa trying to, let's get back to disorganized and organized crime, trying to work out how to fend off social engineering-based attacks by organized crime that stand to make billions of dollars potentially out of this industry generally, but Ottawa Hospital, just one of another 100 people they're going to target next quarter. Like, what chance have they got? And what's curious about that is, like, if you make I don't know a huge amount around traditional warfare, but my understanding is that the advantage in defense, if you're good at defense, then the person attacking is spending 10 times the resources because you can get good at defense. And my understanding is in information security, that's especially true. It can be David and Goliath, but if you're David and you've got an incredibly good defense option, they can hack all they want and you're in a pretty good position. Is that am I understanding that correctly?
You're spot on. You are absolutely spot on. So there's large companies like the Goldman Sachs, all that sort of stuff. They spend a lot on security and have that really strong defensive position. But there's other organizations who've got a few key staff that can think like a hacker, that can put the tools and techniques in place, that can even counter these big, large organizations trying to attack the network.
Yeah, and that feels to me like where it's all going. And part of it is getting back to kind of governments and NGOs. I think a lot of what we're trying to do in discussing this on the show is try to understand the impact for, I don't use the wrong word, but developing economies or marginalized people more broadly. If you take, not to pick on Medibank, but just to use that example, there was 3 million plus records, I think, were stolen in that example in Australia. 1 in 10 people in Australia had it stolen. And hopefully I've got those numbers right, or roughly right. Regardless of whether that data is correct, in terms of I'm trying to understand who it impacts more. Is it impacting high net worth people with money and they lose part of their money, or is it impacting normal people who are already having a hard time trying to get on with their lives, or people who aren't even in the system, for example, who Aboriginal in a remote community from your example earlier? How are people impacted by this stuff?
I'll ask you a question to answer your question. If you're a Medibank customer and that information came out, would you care?
Yes.
You would care. So there's people like you that care. We're not financially impacted by this. We might be inconvenienced, maybe new license number, stuff like that. But you've got people who are like, maybe had an abortion, maybe you've got alcohol issues and stuff, mental health issues and all that sort of stuff out there that is now public accessible. That's not supposed to be public accessible. So I was a big advocate of Medibank to pay that ransom because this is not a financial crime. You pay the money, the data may or may not get leaked anyway, but you're dealing with a lot of sensitive people. And for me, this is one of those things is just pay up and shut up. There's a lot of people who you think you and I might be able to handle a leak. There's a lot of people who would not be able to handle the leak of this sort of data out into the community.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So essentially where we've landed is that there is both a kind of internal entropy kind of problem, there's a social engineering problem, and there is, in a smaller degree, if you're not doing stuff right, there is potentially an actual people getting in through a firewall and doing all that stuff. But the vast majority of problems are in those first two. Joined into this problem is that the majority of the things that you might use to either help educate people or to understand what people are doing that they shouldn't be doing are technologies and tools and resources that are unbelievably expensive and inaccessible to the vast majority of organizations. And even the ones who do have the resources still look at it, sticker shock, cut the number in a third. And so a huge lever for us globally is to work out how to make all of this stuff more affordable, more accessible so that more people can implement this inside their organizations and that we level up. Just coming into the customer, the end customer, the individual, I think the majority of people who'll be listening today ultimately are part of the problem/solution in terms of you can take some degree of accountability for where your data is and who has your data and how they're utilizing it. Just in terms of what they might be doing as an individual to be better in control of and have better kind of relationship with their own data. What are the kind of the things that you would be thinking of just on that level?
You know, they sound pretty basic, but These are pretty much a common message that all us InfoSec people would recommend is always use 2FA if you've got the access, two-factor authentication. Just make sure you have it. Don't think I'll do it later. Set it up default. Use a password manager. You always use a complex password that you don't even know the result. You just have one password to access it. And always use a VPN. Doesn't matter whether you're in your home or whether you're on holiday in Bali or you're in a hotel. Always use a VPN. Never trust the connection. They're the basic things that I would do. And then there's some more complex things, but they're the three things that I would recommend for all users.
Just because the first two, for sure, I think people encounter. Like, there's a bunch of services you can't use without 2FA. I'm curious about the one relating to 2FA, though. Is your thought, if they offer it, use it, even if you don't think this thing has data that's that sensitive from your perspective? Like, I've had services where I'm like, really, I don't need 2FA for that.
Yeah, look, I'm with you. I don't need it, but it's really more of a habit. So right. I think it's up to you and I to make it a habit, as users to make it a habit. And you never know that the system that you're using may have 2FA, you don't think you need it, but all of a sudden you start using more often, they start adding more features, and all of a sudden it started off being just a little bit of data and then there's a lot more data. Instead of making that decision a year later, just put it on, don't think twice about it, and make it a good habit for everything.
Yeah, used to it. And then my follow-on was just relating to the VPN aspect. A lot of if you've ever watched any YouTube, you've seen an ad for a VPN. Curious about like just the nature of how what role the VPN plays in the context of what we've just spoken about over the last sort of 35 minutes.
Yeah, so a VPN essentially creates a secure layer over your comms. So it essentially encrypts your comms, whether you think it's encrypted or not. So it doesn't matter whether you're on a phone in Turkey or in a hotel in Bali and you're using your computer. I guarantee there'll be people like me that'll be on the network and physically can then look at your traffic. They're putting up fake websites or putting up, fake hotspots who will then just get your credit card information. And then, how many times you go overseas and your credit card's being done over? That's because of these sort of hackers. It's easy to penetrate a hotel network, and then they're just grabbing that information. So as a habit, phone or computer, I always run a VPN, whether I'm at home or traveling. Again, good practice.
Beautiful. Sorry, it was definitely a tangent, not a usual thing we talk about on the show, but I was like, if we're here, there's no reason why we wouldn't get that part of the messaging out to the audience. Just my kind of like last question, just coming back to SIEMonster, which by the way is not CSEA, it's SIE. To tie into the larger acronym, just for people who are listening, like might want to look at it. I'm curious about two things. I'm curious about where you guys are up to in terms of as an organization and kind of the types of organizations. You've mentioned a hospital in Ottawa, the types of organizations who you think where this is a sweet spot for us, because I'm curious about like where to from here for you guys as the last question.
Yeah, so what essentially, if you want to use a SIEM now in say AWS or Google or Azure, in cloud, you've essentially got three choices. You've got Security Lake in AWS, you've got Google Chronicle, or you've got Sentinel. Now, these are MSSP grade products for end users to come on, and then Microsoft or Google or AWS will charge a certain rate. Every gigabyte will be, 50 cents that you ingest in the system. And that's their pricing model. Where we come in is we essentially provide that same solution so that you can then choose your own hardware requirements. You're not stuck with the 50 cents a gigabyte. You can choose this hardware, you can choose this amount of storage, and you're not penalized. So MSSPs take advantage of our SIEMonster solution. They white label it and they sell a cloud-based SIEM solution for their customers, and then they can control the hardware and contract requirements. So for example, if I go with Google, for example, at 50 cents a gigabyte, that's the charge. Whereas if I sign a 3 or 5 year contract with Google and do upfront payments, I can then reduce those costs on virtual hardware. So MSSPs will use our solution, pay it upfront, get a reduced rate, still put maybe a 50 cent or 40 cent per gigabyte in front of the tenant, but there's a bigger margin to be made. That seems to be our sweet spot. You asked about our customers. So MSSPs, we've got financial institutions, universities.
What's an MSSP, sorry?
It's a managed security provider. So essentially, they provide security services for your customers in Australia. That would be Telstra. For US companies, that would be AT&T. And there's a million MSSPs out there. And essentially, they do all the security stuff for you. Whether you want to do pen tests or audits or SIEM solutions and stuff like that, they're one-stop shop for security.
Interesting. And I know I said it was my last question, but I always find something I want to ask from the last answer. Just in terms of the nature of the way this works, in some respects, so Mark Andreessen talked about the software's eating the world and every company's becoming a technology company. In your observation, that that seems to end at a lot of companies now. Plenty of companies will have IT folks internally, right? They might have someone who does IT support. They may have some engineers if they're building some stuff for themselves. They might have a data analyst if they've got a set of data that they're using. And I'm even talking about small companies, not just tech startup companies as well. But in a small to medium-sized organization, they're not big enough to warrant having the quality of cybersecurity personnel. So it always ends up being an agency-based relationship. Is that kind of how security ends up in the organization?
Yeah, you're right. So essentially, you then trust your MSSP to make those decisions for you. Like we trust this one-stop shop to provide it, but you still need that auditory function. So someone to actually audit what the service they're getting provided. So an IT audit person. And then you say you're going to give us a report every 3 months, make sure that actually happens so you actually can see the results.
Yeah. And do you imagine a world where a small organization can do better at security management directly? And so that the things become so accessible and so democratized that you just plug it and you order it like you order Telstra because you need NBN and then you need this other thing to stay secure. Is that kind of tangentially where we're heading?
I think so. There's a lot of new people coming into the industry, but we're very bottom heavy at the moment. There's a lot of skilled people and intermediate, and there's this new generation coming in that want to do pen testing. They're not ready for it yet. So companies are employing these people that don't really have the skills. They're going to make mistakes. But I think as that education goes forward, that it'll a next area of defense, maybe 3 or 5 years time, I can see that being a bigger piece of the puzzle where those smaller companies can have the assets they need.
Fascinating. A lot more to ask, but we'll leave it there for today, Chris. Thank you for joining. Thank you for illuminating me on a bunch of different stuff and for everything else. And also, I think, for shifting your industry in the right direction as well. I think ultimately, if more companies can get access to more of the kinds of stuff that you have and that does better, we're going to be better off fundamentally more broadly. So thank you.
Thank you for all the great questions.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.